The auctioneer had barely finished describing the plow row as 20, sold as one lot. Hate to even waste your time when Otis Brandt raised his hand for the first bid, and the man everybody in 3 counties called Kubota laughed loud enough that a couple of people standing near the coffee truck turned around to see what was funny. "Otis, there's nothing under that rust but more rust," Dean Castle said, not unkindly, the way a man says something he's said 100 times before about other people's bad ideas. Not cruel, just confident, in the particular way a man gets after 22 years of being right about most things at most auctions. Dean had sold Kubota tractors out of the same dealership outside Monticello, Illinois, for 22 years, talked about the brand so constantly that half the county had stopped using his actual name sometime around year 3, and he had no particular reason that morning to think this auction would be any different from the dozen others where he'd watched somebody pay too much for a pile of rust. He'd already bought 2 newer tractors and a disc that morning for customers waiting on trade-ins. Real money changing hands in a way the plow row clearly wasn't going to produce. 40 minutes later, nobody standing near that plow row was laughing, least of all Dean. There's something about a person who doesn't have to prove anything. If you know what I mean, you'll know why this story is worth your time. Hit subscribe and stay with us. The auction was held the 3rd Saturday of September on the late Delbert Yancey's place outside Monticello in Piatt County, Illinois, after Delbert died that summer at 89 and left behind, among other things, a row of 20 plows he'd been picking up at sales and roadside ditches for the better part of 6 decades and never gotten around to doing anything with. He'd farmed 1,100 acres of his own in his working years, but the plows had been a separate thing entirely. A habit that started, by his daughter's account, sometime in the early 60s when a neighbor offered him an old walking plow for $10 rather than hauling it to the scrapyard himself. Walking plows. Sulky plows, a couple of early tractor-drawn 3 bottoms gone orange with rust clear through the moldboards. The Yancey family wanted the row gone in one transaction rather than 20 separate headaches, so the auctioneer announced it as a single money bid before the bidding ever opened. The whole lot, or nothing. Marlin Tews, who'd farmed the section next to Delbert's for going on 40 years and showed up to every estate sale in the township whether he meant to bid or not, stood near the plow row most of the morning telling anybody who'd listen that Delbert used to say he'd get around to fixing those plows up someday. The same thing he'd been saying since at least the Carter administration by Marlin's own count. Otis Brandt had run Brandt's Antique Iron out of a pole barn outside Bement for going on 31 years, restoring and dealing in old farm equipment to collectors, museums, and the occasional working Amish shop that still wanted a horse-drawn implement, repaired rather than replaced. Most months the business ran on patience more than volume, 3 or 4 real sales a year carrying the operation through the slower stretches, the same way it had for Cecil before him. He'd learned the trade from a man named Cecil Atterbury, who'd run a similar operation 2 counties over back in the 70s and let a teenage Otis hang around his shop asking questions nobody else seemed interested in asking. "Paint lies," Cecil used to tell him, dropping the article the way he did most days when he was elbow deep in something and didn't have breath to spare on extra words. "Iron don't." Cecil had been gone better than 20 years by the morning of the Yancey sale, but Otis still walked a row of equipment the same patient way Cecil had taught him to. Tags first, casting marks second, paint last, because paint lies and iron doesn't. He'd spotted 3 pieces in that row worth real money before the bidding even opened, walking the line slow with a flashlight at 7 that morning, while most of the crowd was still drinking coffee out of styrofoam cups, his breath showing in the cool September air. He checked the casting marks on each beam. He checked the share patterns against the catalog photographs saved on his phone. He checked the underside of every moldboard for a flake of original paint, The kind of detail nobody else in that field had any particular reason to go looking for. An Oliver No. 7 sulky plow, the seat frame intact, faint traces of the original red and green pinstriping still visible under 60 years of rust where the moldboard had been shielded some by an old tarp. A walking plow stamped P&O along the beam. Parlin and Orendorff out of Canton, Illinois. A company that hadn't made a plow since the 1920s, and whose surviving pieces drew real money from collectors who specialized in Illinois, made iron specifically. And an Avery riding plow with a share pattern Otis recognized from a catalog reprint sitting on his own shop shelf. Rare enough that he'd only ever seen 2 others come up for sale in 30 years of looking. 20 plows, the auctioneer called, opening the bidding at $100. Dean bid first, almost reflexively, $200. The kind of number a man throws out when he figures the scrap weight alone covers it and nobody serious is going to fight him for it. Otis raised it to $300. Dean glanced over at him, the way a man glances at somebody he's starting to suspect knows something he doesn't, and went to $4 anyway, mostly out of habit. Otis went to $5. $500 for 20 rust buckets, Dean said, shaking his head, loud enough for the people near him to hear. Tractors running on the rust could just about heat your shop with what's left of these. A few people laughed. Otis didn't say anything back. He just raised the paddle to $600. Dean held at $650, a number that made some private sense to him that nobody standing around him could see, and Otis closed it out at $700. The auctioneer called it once, twice, 3 times, and brought the hammer down. 20 plows, $35 apiece by anybody's quick math, sold to a man half the crowd figured, had just wasted a perfectly good $700 on scrap. Marlin Tews told him, walking back toward the trucks afterward, that Delbert would have gotten a kick out of watching somebody finally pay real money for those things, even if it was only $700 worth of real money. What none of them understood, Dean included, was the difference between rust and ruin. Surface rust on cast iron and old tool steel looks considerably worse than it usually is. A coating that builds up over decades of weather without necessarily touching the structural integrity underneath it. The same way a man's hands can look weathered and worn without the bones underneath being broken. Not always, of course. Sometimes rust really is just rust all the way through, and Otis had been wrong often enough over 31 years to know better than to assume otherwise without checking. A casting mark stamped into a beam or a frog doesn't rust away. A share-specific tooth pattern doesn't change because the surface has gone orange, and a flake of original paint, protected under a fold of canvas or the shadow of another implement for 60 years, tells a collector something a clean repaint never could. That the piece in front of him hadn't been touched, hadn't been faked up to look older or rarer than it actually was, which to the right buyer matters more than nearly anything else about the object. It took Otis the better part of 4 months to clean and stabilize the 3 good pieces, working slow, careful not to do anything that collectors would consider over restoration. The kind of heavy-handed repaint that can cut a piece's value by half in the eyes of somebody who wants originality over shine. He used a soft brass brush rather than a wire wheel on anything showing a trace of original paint, a wax sealant rather than fresh enamel on the bare iron, and a magnifying loupe to confirm casting numbers he could have sworn he already knew by heart. Asked once by a fellow dealer at a swap meet that winter whether he'd known for certain at the auction exactly what those 3 pieces would bring, Otis said he honestly hadn't. He'd known they were worth real money. He hadn't known whether real money meant $2,000 or $20, not until he'd cleaned them up enough to photograph properly and started making calls. He sold the Oliver No. 7 in January to a private collector in Indiana for $4,200. The P&O walking plow went to the Piatt County Historical Society in March for $2,800, the museum board deciding the piece belonged closer to home than a private buyer's barn would have kept it. The Avery riding plow sold in May at a specialty antique equipment auction in Iowa for $6,500, the highest single number of the three. A fourth-piece Otis hadn't even flagged that first morning. A small steel beam plow with a faint stamp reading Monticello Plow Works. A defunct local foundry nobody in 3 counties had heard of in decades. Turned up once he'd cleaned the beam properly. And sold to a regional collector specializing in Illinois foundry pieces for $1,900. The remaining 16 plows went for scrap and parts over the following months, bringing in another $2,100 combined. Added together, and the 4 good pieces and the scrap both brought the total to $17,500, against a $700 purchase and roughly $650 in cleaning supplies, transport, and the gas it took hauling 20 plows back to Bement on 3 separate trailer loads. Call it $16,150 clear off a single morning's bidding. Most of the crowd standing around that plow row figured was a waste of $700. Otis never thought of it as a gamble, the way some of the men standing near the coffee truck that morning clearly assumed it was. A gamble was bidding on something hoping the math worked out in your favor. What he'd done was closer to checking the math first, quietly, with a flashlight, before anybody else in that field had bothered to look past the rust. Word travels through a county that size whether anybody means for it to or not. Dean heard about the museum sale first, from a customer mentioning it while picking up parts for a mower deck, and didn't say much back beyond writing out the receipt. He heard the rest of the numbers piecemeal over the following months, the way bad math arrives in installments when nobody particularly wants to deliver it all at once. The Indiana sale from a parts supplier who knew the buyer. The Iowa sale from a farm magazine notice somebody left on his desk without explanation. The foundry plow from Marlin Tews himself, who made a point of stopping by the dealership specifically to mention it. He wasn't a fool about it, and nobody who knew him would call him careless either. He'd simply spent 22 years selling new equipment to people who wanted new equipment, and had never once looked sideways at the considerably older, considerably quieter market sitting right next to it the whole time, under a layer of rust he'd mistaken for the whole story instead of just the outside of it. Otis Brandt is 62 this year. He still runs Brandt's Antique Iron out of the same pole barn. Still walks estate sale equipment rows with a flashlight and a patient eye before the bidding ever opens. Still hauls everything home behind the same Chevy 3/4 ton he's driven since 2011. And has bought 2 more full equipment lots since the Yancey sale, both times for close to scrap money. Both times with nobody bidding hard against him. He keeps a photograph of Cecil Atterbury on the shop wall, the only one he has of the man, and still finds himself thinking, more often than he'd have expected, about how much Cecil would have enjoyed hearing exactly how the Yancey sale turned out. Dean Castle still sells Kubota tractors outside Monticello, still does fine for himself, and has started, according to people who'd know, looking a little longer at the older equipment that comes through his own trade in lot before sending it straight to scrap. He hasn't said much about the Yancey sale to anybody who wasn't already there. Some men go quiet when they're embarrassed. Dean went quiet, by most accounts, because he was doing math in his head he hadn't thought to do before, and the rust on that row of plows turned out to be hiding considerably more than he'd ever stopped to check. Marlin Tews still brings the story up at every estate sale he attends, standing wherever the equipment row happens to be that particular Saturday, telling anybody new to the crowd about the time a man paid $700 for 20 rust buckets and walked away with more money than the rest of the auction combined. He usually finishes the same way, dry, that Delbert Yancey would have gotten the biggest kick out of all of it. watching somebody else finally finish what he'd spent 60 years meaning to get around to.